So when is the last time you've been back here?
I was here 4 times when my book came out in the fall, and the last time was in November.
Okay, so I'm always very curious to ask when people have read your book, and yeah, obviously you see what critics write about it, what the media writes about it, but what have people said to you after reading it? What kind of stories have they related to, I guess, the things that they can relate to in your book?
You know, what happens, which is very heartwarming, and of course, you write a book to try to, for a lot of different reasons, but the one that always means the most to me is the way it connects to people. So it might not be a specific, well, I'll tell you one thing, is that when I was here in November, literally 10 people came up to me and said, I lived in that neighborhood on the west side. You went to Winterhalter Elementary School, so did I. Mm-hmm. And then they'd say, and I was born in 1949, so we must have been in the same class, you know, which is, but it's, when you write a book, each individual takes their own history into the reading of the book. And so it's the way that they connect to it in so many different ways. I mean, just yesterday, I got a letter from David Bonnier, you know, the former congressman, and he was writing about all of the elements of his life in Detroit that came back to him because of the book.
Everyone wants to share a little bit of a story. So were you able to visit your old neighborhood?
I went to that neighborhood the first day of the book tour. Mm-hmm. I came to Detroit, and Kai Ryssdal of NPR's Marketplace wanted to meet me in Detroit and do an interview. So he said, David, let's go out to your old house, you know, the flat on Dexter. And so I hadn't been there in a few years to that place. So we drove out there, and it was gone. Literally, there was that sort of police tape around the vacant lot, and the rubble was still there.
Had it just been demoed?
It had just been demoed. And so, and probably 4 out of the 10 houses on that particular block were gone. So I told that story a couple of days later to Mayor Duggan. He invited me to lunch in his office, and we had a sandwich and chips. That's kind of the way this guy
Standard
is.
fare,
yeah. And I said, you know, I went out to my house, and it was torn down. And he knew that block, and he knew why it was torn down. And so while my misimpression or impression was that meant that this area was a disaster, he was making the argument that it was torn down on purpose for the reasons of understanding what houses are problematic in each neighborhood and how to revive the neighborhood.
It must have been interesting to have chosen to write this book about the time period that you did in 2011 after seeing the Super Bowl ad, and I'm sure you're a huge Eminem fan. But then writing it during—
I am now.
You are now. But then writing it during the process of what Detroit has gone through now over these past 5 years. So let's try to take your book and what you wrote and put it a little bit into context of where we are today, and what kind of parallels do you now see in taking those 4 topics that you took? If you took cars, you took civil rights, labor, and Motown.
Well, you start with civil rights and race, because I think that is and always has been the great American dilemma. It's interesting, in the summer of '63, there was a shooting incident in Detroit. A black prostitute was shot in the back by the police, and it sort of it brought up a lot of the tensions again, and kind of reverberations that you see today in Ferguson and other places. But you know, I'm not in Detroit every day, and I know there are still a lot of different tensions in the city over issues. But I think that Detroit hit a place where it sort of liberated the city, in a sense, to make it possible for people to realize that they needed to get together to get out of this mess. And so, although there's still tensions over issues like the schools, I think there's a larger sensibility and an awareness, which I think this conference represents. I mean, I'm not here as a salesperson, but I think my largest feeling about Detroit and its renaissance is it's great to have the downtown come back and the Cass Corridor and young people coming here like it's a new Brooklyn, although, you know, I like Detroit better than Brooklyn. But
someone's like, yes, yes.
But until the neighborhoods are revived, you can't call it a renaissance. And that has to do with a lot of things, economic and racial, that can bring that together. In terms of music, I don't worry about Motown. I mean, it's tragic that Motown left for Los Angeles. That was many, many decades ago. But Motown never dies. I mean, it's there forever. It's the beautiful music of this city, and it will always represent this city.
I want to go back. I think a lot of people can agree with that. I want to go back to what you said about neighborhoods and revitalizing that. And obviously, you've seen a lot of change in the downtown just in the time that you've come here, and we've all seen it. But how do you translate that energy into the neighborhoods? And how crucial is that for Detroit to move on to this next level that I think so many people want to see the city go to?
Well, it's the key to everything, I think, neighborhoods are. And Detroit was a city of neighborhoods. And I think that, one of the lessons of that period that I write about is that there were neighborhood tensions there, and the city did not deal with them. They didn't figure out how to do it. And so, you cannot repeat that sense of people feeling they're in competition with each other as opposed to working together with each other. It's a very difficult. It's a really difficult issue, but it's necessary, and you have to focus on those neighborhoods, which are the key to any city, really. Part of it has to do with having good schools, so people want to live in different neighborhoods. Part of it has to do with the economic development, not just having everything downtown. You see some restaurants and other activities in different neighborhoods, but those have to be encouraged more even than what's going on downtown to keep the whole city alive.
Yeah, I want to pick up on something that you said on education, and you did talk about how so many kids were involved in music back in the era that you wrote about in the book, and talking about Martha Reeves. What I really liked about your book is the detail in a lot of different places, and even in the parenthesis, and you even put that 12,000 elementary school kids at one time were part of a music program. How would you say how we treat education now in terms of what you saw back in the 60s and putting an emphasis on the arts like that, and where we are today?
Well, this is just my own personal feelings. They have nothing to do with, I'm not a policy expert in education, but my feeling about life, I write because I love to write. I think you have to find what young people love to do and give them the opportunities to do that, whatever it is. And so the whole notion that you have to just keep pounding on science and math, of course that's important for the new world and computers. Any kid naturally can, a 4-year-old can do a lot of computer stuff better than I can. So I'm not so much worried about that. It's getting the key for that aspect is just getting the material to them, the computers to them, and all of the different devices. But I think that the arts are essential, and Detroit is an art city. You've got this one of the great art museums in the world here. You've got this wonderful music. It's not just Motown, but the history of jazz in Detroit is incredibly important. And so, I think you should emphasize what Detroit is best at, and the arts are really part of that. So if I ran the school system here, I would say Detroit is the greatest art school in the country. That's what I would focus on.
When you were going through and you were researching for the time period that you looked at in the book, did you say to yourself, oh my gosh, some of the things that I'm seeing here, we're repeating now in 2016?
Yes. It's a very different situation, but some things do repeat themselves. And or they could repeat. I should say they could be repeated. So, as great as it is that a few very, very rich people are investing a lot of money in downtown, you don't want to rely on a few people. It has to be much more dispersed than that for it to really. So you can't be vulnerable like that, and that's what Detroit was so vulnerable in the 60s because it was relying on one industry. And so the more you can diversify, the better. And so I would be cautious about that.
One of the things in your book that you said that was a warning sign of the road that Detroit was going to go down was a study that Wayne State did in looking at population, and that the projected population was going to drop to 1.2 million from 1.6 million
Yep.
by 1970. One of the things that Mayor Mike Duggan has really put emphasis on is saying, in order for Detroit to succeed, I'm going to grow the population of this city in 5 years. It's a very tall task. But what do you see are potential roadblocks, or what do you see are potential pluses for us to achieve that goal, not just to stabilize population, but to grow population?
Well, there are a few different things. If you just took the young people that are coming into the city, which infuses the city with energy, creates certain problems that they could be problems that you have to deal with. One is that the young people coming in don't just take over neighborhoods and move other people out, but become part of the larger culture of the city. And the second is that when these kids come in, they stay. And that means that they're going to get married and have kids and want them to go to schools. And so the schools are the center to keeping that population growing. You have to have good schools. Otherwise, young people will move to Detroit, and after 5 years, they'll go somewhere, they'll go out to the suburbs or somewhere else. Another way to grow the city is through immigrants. And, that's one of the great political issues of this year, in a lot of different ways, some real and some artificial. But Detroit and all great cities in America were fueled by immigrants. And the more that Detroit can figure out ways to bring them in and keep the energy going and have them develop their own entrepreneurial spirits, whether it's Syrian refugees, which of course is a controversial issue everywhere, but should not be, in my opinion, if it's handled right. But I think that's another way to grow the city.
Let's look a little bit about, I guess, parallel back from your book to now, looking at cars and looking at labor. I mean, we've seen the auto industry take some tremendous turns, and especially here, even looking in 2008, 2009. How would you compare the two?
Well, in the period that I was writing about, the industry was starting to leave Detroit. You could see it happening. And it was not just physical leaving in terms of plants being built elsewhere and the ancillary industries moving out of Detroit, and that was for a lot of different reasons, and then eventually moving out of the country. But it was also emotionally leaving Detroit. And I think that was as important as anything, that the leaders of the auto industry did not realize that the city of Detroit was the beating heart of everything that they represented. And so and I think you see now them starting to realize that. I mean, that's why the Ford Foundation, which of course is separate from Ford, but nonetheless came out of it, was so instrumental in the what was called the Grand Bargain, and why many of the foundations related to the auto industry are now investing in Detroit itself, because that is so essential. So, I think that the auto industry will never go back to what it was. You can't revert, but you can learn the lessons from the past. And one of the key lessons was how important the city of Detroit was to the whole industry.
So if you were to write another book about Detroit, and I'm sure that's on your list of things to do, your next book about Detroit, what 4 topics would be in that, or what would you write about Detroit?
Well, I don't know, but I certainly would. I think what I would write is what happens when a place hits rock bottom, and how does that liberate it and allow it to recover? And so, in a lot of ways, I think Detroit is ahead of most other cities in America, which are, Detroit has gone through a lot of things that those cities are still going through. So for all of its difficulties, it's more of a clean slate in some ways, with the key exception of the schools. And I think I would probably write a lot about that. And but I don't have any answers now, aside from the little ones that I was talking about. But I think that would be fascinating to study. How, how can, it seems like an intractable problem, but it's not. And why can't Detroit put the same energy into that it's put into trying to revive its downtown and so on?
The national spotlight has been on Detroit now for a number of years, and we get a lot of national journalists that come into Detroit, write Detroit's story or what they think is Detroit's story. As a journalist, do you think people have told Detroit's story well, or had they been accurate in telling Detroit's story from the time that you have now spent here?
I'm hesitant to stereotype the media telling of a story. I think, there are some people have done it well and some haven't. It's really easy to stereotype any city. And, and it's only when you're in the place and really invested in it that you can, sometimes a foreign correspondent can see things that people who've lived there their whole lives can't see. So, there are different perspectives that are valuable. But for me, as a journalist, as an author, always the most important thing for me is to people say you got it right. That these were not just the stereotypes that are imposed on a place, but the reality of it. And that's always complex. It's not, cities and people are not easily reduced to good and bad, right and wrong. There's a lot of, in all of us, in all cities and in all human beings, there are a lot of these contradictions. And it's just being understanding of those contradictions and giving each of them the weight that they deserve that makes a story or a book valid and real.
All right, in the 2 minutes that we have left, I can't let you go without talking about a little bit of politics. You've been quite busy the last couple of weeks. So what's your road trip schedule now for the next way? And when you answer that, give us a little insight into what Michigan's role is going to be in this presidential primary.
Well, I don't know why I did it, but I decided to do this project called Looking for America, and I started in Iowa, went to New Hampshire, then Las Vegas, and now Michigan, and I'm going down to Texas, just talking to people. It's not really about the candidates or the insides of the campaigns. I just wanted to get the sensibility of the country in this crazy, tumultuous election year. Every single pundit from the very beginning has been wrong about everything. So luckily, I'm not in that game. But there's so many different interesting cross-currents going on in this election that I think, are going to have long-term effects on this nation. It seems like it's a culmination of all of these trends in politics, economy, technology, entertainment, all coming together in this weird amalgam that's brought us Donald Trump, among other things.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there. David Maraniss, thank you so much for being here with us. I want to say one quote from your book that you quoted Mayor Kavanaugh as saying that Detroit is a city on the move, a city with a tremendously interesting and dramatic story to tell. And he said that in the 60s, and I think it still holds true today. And so stay tuned for the next part of this.